This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
This is Bryan Rosensteel from Ping Identity.
Today, we're going to talk about multi-factor authentication in the federal government. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Today, we have Bryan Rosensteel in the virtual studio. He's the U.S. Federal CTO at Ping Identity, and we're going to focus on multi-factor authentication. Now, Bryan, I have to confess here, I'm a teacher. I teach down at the school downtown, and when I first heard the phrase MFA, I thought it was Master of Fine Arts. and I said, what do you mean MFA? What's that got to do with identity? And then I was sternly corrected by a guest. No, not that MFA. We're talking about a different MFA. We're going to talk about multi-factor authentication. And the reason my guests are interested in this is because everyone's looking around at the pillars. There's 6 pillars there. There's 5 pillars there. You have 20 pillars. The first pillar is always identity. And so, yeah, let's talk about the first pillar, then worry about the other silly ones after that. Now, they're important. We know that. But why is the DOD and different organizations always put identity as the first pillar? And many times when you start talking about identity, pops up multi-factor authentication. So let's get in there first. Maybe a thumbnail sketch of your background. And I think people pretty much know what Ping is all about. But maybe you can tell us about Ping, and then we'll jump in, Bryan.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of my background and where I've come from and why it is that I've gone down this rabbit hole that is MFA, not Masters of Fine Arts, right? Multi-factor authentication. But I'm going to remember that now and get a chuckle. So I've been in the public sector for, I don't know, like 20 years. Like most of my career has all been spent kind of in one part of the public sector or another. But I bumbled my way into federal identity, right? And we call it FICAM, Federal Identity Credential and Access Management. And that was about, I don't know, like 12 years ago. And when I did that, I went into a very specific authenticator called PKI, Public Key Infrastructure. I didn't even know how to spell it. And then I started learning all about it and started learning, stronger forms and ways that you can log into systems other than just the username and password, which was pretty much all I knew, and really started to love it. And so I've been doing that. I was with the federal government for a while, kind of supporting them directly, then moved over to kind of the advisory role, where I'd work more kind of across the different government and learn about some really interesting kind of unique use cases about, hey, we can't log in with all of these normal things because we're doing this crazy thing in this crazy environment, and kind of helping them sort through that. And then, found myself here at Ping Identity. So the neat thing about Ping Identity, when we think about authentication, when we think about what it means to log in, there's really what we consider 3 different parts. One, you have to go through and you have to do this notion of identity vetting. So how can I trust that you are who you say you are? We start by, doing a whole bunch of verification checks, whether that's I'm going to present certain, pre-established documents, birth certificates, driver's license, passport, whatever it might be. And that starts establishing, okay, you are who you say you are. And then now we're going to give you this new authenticator that you can use to log in with, right? And that multi-factor authentication that we'll probably be talking about a lot today. And then after that, there's the actual process of logging in. And how do you make that work, logging into many different applications in a way that, isn't too onerous on the user? So I have always played kind of in that middle realm of just that strong credential, but Ping Identity plays across all 3. And so when I saw that, I'm like, you know what, this is a great way to see this identity all the way through. From, hey, we have this unknown user, we're going to build that trust, we're going to give them this trusted credential that they can use to establish themselves during authentication, and then bring them into applications. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
I mentioned the school I teach at Georgetown, and they have multi-factor authentication, and they use this Duo system. And when you go online, it gives you a code. And I mean, we've all done this. Everyone's listening to this, and they've done a little 6-digit code. You put it in, you're authenticated. Now, one could argue that, hey, that's remember the phrase, pretty good security, pretty good encryption. So that's pretty good. So what is the weakness of this multi-factor authentication for federal systems?
Yeah, so the key to that is federal systems.
Yeah.
So when we talk about multi-factor authentication, there are different levels, and really we divide. So we should explain too. Multi-factor authentication means multiple factors of authentication. So what do I mean by multiple factors? Well, typically we break those down into three: something you have, something you know, and something you are. Passwords are that something you know, right? I've got a memorized secret that I can, reproduce on command. Something you have is usually some type of physical thing. So in your example, Georgetown, they send you an OTP code, and that is being sent to something, right? Usually we see that on a mobile device. You either get like an SMS code, or you get, maybe you have an application, the application gets a notification, you click approve, right? People are doing that now, like Google has done a lot to basically say, oh, if you have the Gmail application, we can use that as this type of authenticator. And then there's something you are is biometrics. The idea is you want to mix a minimum of 2 of these different form factors. So that way someone has to be able to reproduce, as an example, what you've got memorized, and then also reproduce something that you've got in your possession. And that's a lot harder. Now, while that's great, we break these down really into 2 different categories, like I said before: phishable and phishing resistant MFA. That's really important for the federal government. So phishable forms of authenticators, right? Passwords are the perfect example. I got that email and it says, hey, congratulations, you won $500, or oh, we overcharged you. This is Amazon. Log in here, right? And so people all the time, they'll go in, they'll click on these links and be like, oh, I got to log in. And they put in their username and password, but they're putting it into a malicious website. And that website now has the information that you provided. And what did you provide? Your username and your password. Now they have that memorized secret, and they can go and attempt to log in as you somewhere else. And so you have been phished, is what we call that. Well, other types of authenticators can also be phished. So in your example, you got a message with a string of numbers. The OTP is what we call them, one-time passwords. They're only meant to be used once. But what I can do is fake it. And there are ways that they can do this where they say, put in your code. And you've put in that code, but they didn't authenticate against it, which means they didn't invalidate it. So now they've got that password and they have that code, and they can go and log in as you. There are other more sophisticated ways that they do it as well, at the attackers, but they've been pretty much managed to be able to break these types of authenticators such that they can get past that security. So the government has said, hey, look, we can't use these phishable forms of authentication anymore. We have to use phishing resistant authenticators. I'm getting a little technical here. They're all about tying the user to the authentication event. And that sounds like, well, yeah, you always are tied into it. But what that means is I'm trying to log in, let's say, to my computer. So I'm going to use a multi-factor authenticator. Hey, maybe I'm still using username and password. We should get rid of those, but it's very common for people to use those. And I'm going to get that push notification on my phone, right? Well, that push notification on the phone, you could get that anywhere. What they need to do is tie that authentication back to you sitting in front of that computer. And some authenticators can't do this. Others, like what the federal government uses with there are these physical plastic smart cards, kind of look like a credit card. They got this little gold chip on them. They call that a smart card, right? And you'll hear that as PIV or CAC, right? It has all kinds of different acronyms. That requires you to actually physically plug that into a card reader that is connected to that workstation. So now when I go to authenticate, there is this idea that in order to make that authentication work, that user has to be in front of that workstation where they're trying to log in. And that is much harder for an attacker who's going to be remote to be able to impersonate, and ends up with this stronger level of authentication. So the government needs to use that So here's the difference, right? Because depending upon your listener, they might be like, oh, wow, that means what I'm using to log into my email or my social media or whatever it may be, even my bank. If that falls in that phishing, phishable category of MFA, do I have to get off of it? It's about risk reward. So for me, and I'm not going to say my bank and I'm not going to say my authenticators, but I do use phishable forms of MFA for those applications. Why? Well, I'm generally not a target for a nation state attack for my, getting into my personal email. However, for work, when I need to get into, things, especially if I'm dealing with anything a little bit more sensitive, I'm coming in with that stronger authenticator. Why? Because that might be something that a nation state level attacker would go after. So that's
bing,
it.
Bing, wait. Bing, bing, bing. Mm-hmm. Phrase that pays. You hit the radio. Phrase that pays here, OMB Memorandum 2209, date January 26, 2022. Here's the quote. Strong authentication across enterprise. That's what you just said. We could take a transcript of that and give me 4 words on it. It is strong across an enterprise. And you said the words exactly. If you're going to go to Joe's Donuts and order some donuts for this app, factor authentication, maybe university is going to be my next level. There's a phrase that pops up that maybe some of our listeners are thinking, and the word is fatigue, MFA fatigue. And so what possibly can happen is let's say I work for a federal agency and I try to get in and we're just, maybe it's an MFA. And what happens, I get so many darn alerts, so many push notifications. I go, I'm sick of it. I'm just going to click, bang, MFA. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is what your secure system prevents MFA fatigue, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So this is, and this is one of the huge problems, is if I send a user a request to log in, so I've got their username and password, and I'm going to send them that push notification on the mobile device in that application. All I got to do is click approve. The user eventually is going to click approve, even though they're actually not trying to log in. In fact, some users afterwards, right, because they've done tests on this or they've done after action kind of reports of why did you click approve? They're like, well, I was always told to click approve, right? So some users were trained and have been trained. You always accept. Other users are like, I just got tired of it and I just clicked approve so it would go away, right?
Yep.
And then we had and I'm not going to pick on any one company, right? Because breaches happen, but there was a high profile case where a company, one of their administrators had gotten, hacked, and they were using this push MFA, and the attackers had been hitting that administrator nonstop, and he was denying, doing what he should do. And eventually they reached out to him and said, hey, we need you to stop denying. We have a problem and we need to log in and we need you to click accept. So they did.
Wow.
And they got in again, because there's not this tie-in to where, it has to be that physical device that you're logging in from. They were able to do it remotely. And so, that's this idea of this fatigue. We've trained users to be accepting these authentications, even if they're not trying to authenticate.
Wow.
Right. And that has been a persistent issue.
Brian, back when you were in grade school, I was taking all these silly security tests and all the acronyms, and I learned about a lot of acronyms. Role-based access, RBAC, attribute-based, ABAC. Okay, I learned all those, and some people use them, some people don't. But now I see phrases, and I don't even know if this is an official phrase you have to take a test and understand. Identity-based access control. So two-factor authentication, 2FA. Does that mean it's identity-based because the person has the card? Is that what that means?
No, not entirely, right? So this is where I'll pick on MFA a little bit, and I do it in jest, right? Because I've got certain types of one of the stronger forms known as PKI, public key infrastructure, and I always say I've got PKI in my veins. But even that, which is still considered kind of the gold standard in the federal government, the only thing it tells you is whether or not you can prove that you have possession of private key. That's it, right? And that's all authentication or all the authenticators can do, right? So password memorized secret, I can prove that I can reproduce the memorized secret, right? Biometrics, I can prove that I can reproduce that biometric signature. That's it. It's proof of possession. that doesn't actually tell me if I should authenticate. So identity-based authentication systems, they will take into account the multi-factor authenticator, but they're really looking at the identity. And so this is where some of those acronyms that we're talking about, RBAC and ABAC, role-based access control versus attribute-based access control, come into play. And really what we're talking about is that latter, the attribute-based. We want to look at the entire identity. So what does identity actually mean for the federal government, and really what it should mean for everyone? When you're in when you're going through a digital medium, you have this notion of a digital identity, and that is different than just tying back to the person behind the keyboard. That is actually how you're interacting with a system. Am I coming in from a Windows? Am I coming in from a Mac? What is my antivirus, level at, right? What browser am I using? What time of day is it? What location am I coming from? All of these different things and elements that come in to make the digital you at that time you're logging in. Because, hey, I could be an admin and I could have all the rights and permissions to be logging in. But if I'm coming in from a workstation that is unexpected or is not up to date in security profile, I may not want you to log in. Or a different example, let's say I'm trying to come in and I'm trying to do a job function I'm allowed to do. And I'm coming in from a time of day that you expect. And I'm coming in from a computer that you expect. Except I'm a shift worker and I only work Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I'm coming in on a Tuesday. Maybe I need to question that. There might be a legitimate reason. I may be coming in and filling in for someone, but it's outside the norm and the expected value. And so now I should look at that as a riskier authentication, and I need to then do additional interrogation to make sure this is a legitimate request. That's what we mean by identity-based. That's what we mean by this notion of digital identity. It's far beyond just that person behind that keyboard interacting with the system.
Let's go back. You're in grade school. I'm memorizing all these terms. And one of the phrases I had to memorize to take the silly test was called man in the middle attack. And This was a big deal 20 years ago. It was a big deal. But guess what? 10 minutes ago, when you were describing this whole thing of a phone, and I think that's a man in the middle attack, isn't it? I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's an old concept applied to the new world.
Yeah, no, 100%. So what they'll do, so this is some of the more sophisticated things, right? So you really are now targeting a specific authentication website that's going to have a look and feel of an organization. So you stand up a fake website that looks exactly like the real one. And then the user goes to authenticate, and you manage to redirect the user, usually like email or something like that, to this malicious website. But what ends up happening is the website will the fake website actually redirects to the real one. So you put in the username, you put in the password, right? It actually then puts in the username and password into the actual real website. And then you go in and you put in whatever multi-factor you're putting in, and it'll put that into the real website. Now, there are ways, again, phishing-resistant MFA, there are ways that actually we can detect and mitigate that, but other form factors of MFA aren't as sophisticated. And so now you've actually logged into your real website. It's in a legitimate way, except you've been proxied through this attacker's website. Why does that matter? So we call this kind of session writing. And so now what happens is, as a user, when I log out, well, the log out button isn't real on their fake end. So they still have the session opened. So now you've logged out, and you think you've logged out, and now they're going to go in and be you and interact with the system. The entire time they were just, sitting, and they were learning all of that data, because really that's what they're after. Typically they're after data. And so they're viewing everything that's coming through their proxy, and they now have this open session that they can go in and continue to do more things with, right? So that is and there are other types of man in the middle, but that's a very common one, and a way for them to not even have to worry about breaking that MFA, not having to worry about having to have that user, do that push authentication at the wrong time. This is a legitimate, work effort that they're trying to go through. They've just completely proxied you through their system. Again, clicking on links is a bad thing.
I talked about this OMB memo, and I was silly with this strong authentication and the phrase that pays. But if you read the OMB memo, it talks about consolidating authentication means across the enterprise. And so I guess this is the next step. And so what consolidation means is that, let's say John Gilroy, he logs in from Denver 3 times a week. And we know this, and all of a sudden John Gilroy gets a job in San Francisco, and there's got to be changes. And so I guess we can talk about the baby steps here of MFA, but then part and parcel, and not to, in the same paragraph, by the way, in the memo, it was like consolidate the means to control this. And so that's all well and good, but now you really have to do the two-step here with consolidation. Is that part of what Ping offers?
Yeah, it's part of what we do. And so we're really strongly kind of supporting. So, when you look at, and there's a bunch of different things, right? So we can look at something called FIPS 201 and FIPS 213 is the third revision of it. In something called Section 7, they start talking about, hey, stop doing authentication directly to the application. Instead, you need to do that through what we call federation. And we see that echoed through a couple other NIST documentation as well. What they're referring to here is, rather than logging directly into an application, you log into this other system, and that system then allows you, depending upon your attributes and the policies that you set, to log into different applications. People commonly know this as single sign-on, but really I always talk about it in terms of a federation engine, because you're going to be orchestrating different types of policies, different type of authenticators based upon various factors. Now, why this is important is one of the issues that we've had in the federal government, and really everyone has had, is when you want to support different types of multi-factor authenticators, or even just supporting MFA in general. Not every application is able to support some of these stronger authenticators. Some of them can support MFA at all, right? They're just based on username and password. And so what happens when I need to be able to support a strong authenticator on a mobile device, my physical plastic smart card, and maybe some other forms as well, and my application can only really be configured to support only one of those? That's a problem that we've had and has really slowed adoption. We want to be able to have the flexibility of changing the authenticator just in case if something happens and that authenticator gets compromised. Things can happen. We need to be flexible. We need to be dynamic. We need to be able to change that out. And we need to be able to change that out in a way that we don't have to go application by application to do it. So that's where we get into this notion of federation. We get into this notion of, hey, bring your own authenticator, BYOA, right? If you already have these existing investments, or if you need one, we can supply one as well. And now all of that is in policy, completely separated from the application. The application is agnostic to the what you use to log in, but we can then report that in so you can make authorization decisions. That's a whole different, kettle of fish in how we do that. But what the government is saying is, in order to be able to adapt to today's threats and the speed of today's threats, you need to make sure you've got, as much as possible, these centralized engines that you can go in and make that change. Oh, I know that I no longer can support this type of authenticator because the algorithm has been broken, right? We know that there are collisions in the wild or something like that is what we start talking about from a cryptographic standpoint. I need to stop using that. So I can go in and I can click a button, and now that's no longer allowed to be used across all my applications, regardless if I have 10 applications or 100 applications or 1,000 applications. We have a much faster way to react. And some of this now, you think about the reaction, it doesn't even have to be human-led. We can start actually having decisions being made by AI engines that would feed back in and basically say, hey, this is risky. This type of behavior, we don't think this should proceed. Go ahead and close what we call the session. And now that user is logged out of everything. So it's not having to go and make sure I've logged out of each individual application. I log out of this one central application, and my access across the board has been closed. That's what we're moving towards, and that really augments this notion of a multi-factor authenticator that, again, is only proof of possession of something into this notion of trust but verify. It becomes this extension of your digital identity as a part of, to say that zero trust landscape. Regardless if you have, as you said before, 5 pillars or 6 or 7 or 17.
Yeah. A few years ago, we had this little thing called COVID, and a lot of people had to start logging remotely. And I'm sure people in your business they were staying up nights and drinking coffee and taking whatever have to keep awake and all to figure it out. So I would just think it's almost responding to a problem that happened 3 years ago. Well, sure, we can adapt and change to this and adapt. It could be a scaling. I mean, what about the IRS has to scale? I mean, agencies have to scale, and maybe they don't even know what they have to scale for. There could be an incident, all of a sudden they have to scale. There could be a FEMA incident. So I think the consolidation probably it resolves a question about an application that may be long in the tooth, but it also answers a question about scale, because I go back to this document here. It says across enterprise. It's not John's Donuts. It's large organizations, because things are going to happen that are going to be unexpected. And I think maybe the lesson we learned in the last 3 years is that maybe we should have some ability to control the black swan event. I don't know what's going to happen. Is the earthquake in Washington? I don't know. I mean, but it's a flexible tool. I guess it's a different way of thinking than even before COVID, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so a long time ago, I wrote a little article around the Red Queen hypothesis. So, I talked about I have like 20 years of experience in the federal government. So prior to kind of my second career, if you will, is what I always call it, in identity, I actually used to do evolutionary biology and genetics. And we had this notion of in biology called the Red Queen. So it all had to do with dynamics of predator and prey, right? The rabbit is always trying to be stealthier and have better hearing and better detection. The fox is always trying to have even more camouflage, be even more stealthy, be faster, et cetera, et cetera. And as long as the rabbit is able to keep up and adapt, in a way that keeps pace with the fox, the population dynamics will be about the same. It's called the Red Queen because it actually goes back to a passage from Alice in Wonderland through the Looking Glass, where Alice is running away from the Red Queen, and the ground beneath her is moving at the same speed that she's running, so she's not going anywhere. So ignoring the evolutionary and genetic side of it, which is really fun and I enjoy, I realize actually this is a better way of thinking for cybersecurity than even in biology. And it's not because you need to look at Alice trying to run away from the Red Queen. You need to look at the attacker, the Red Queen, trying to catch up to Alice. See, because as long as Alice is keeping pace with the ground beneath her, the Red Queen has to move twice as quickly. What this means is we can't rely upon static defenses, right, and static strategies. So by having it where I have to go into the policy and specifically define, users have to be part of this member of and use this type of, whatever it needs to be directly in the application, I have to change the application by application. Instead, if I've got something that can more dynamically react or that I can go in and make quick changes, I'm moving faster. So now I'm putting the pressure on the attacker to be able to be twice as innovative as what I can be, in order for them to be able to come in and overtake me, right? That is the idea. You just need to put that pressure by really implementing and embracing these dynamic strategies. Right. And so that was a novel concept. I wouldn't say it's fully novel, but a concept that didn't have the traction it needed to before COVID. But then all of a sudden, when everyone needed to work remotely and people realized, oh, I no longer have government. I mean, some agencies or companies even, right, because, I had talked with companies that had nothing to do with the federal government during this. Their solution was come in and grab your computer and take it home because we have no idea how in the world we can keep things secure if you're using certain parts of the government, they didn't. They had to go. I had friends who worked especially in some of these secure systems. They didn't have a choice. They had to come in. They had to choose shifts. They had to make sure that they planned who was coming in, that there was enough space between them, and they worked all through the pandemic. They didn't work from home. And then others were able to say, okay, we'll change our policy. We will no longer look for this specific device signature consistent with our work systems. But what we'll do is we will adapt and look at these other things that we can pull out of the browser to make the determination as to whether or not you're healthy enough to get into these types of applications. These more sensitive ones that are only for a subset of our users, these applications, will make sure that those particular users get set up with certain types of systems, right? They were able to adapt, and they were able to be very successful during the pandemic. So yeah, that's the difference between I don't know what to do, just go and pick up your computer versus, hey, we have this all centralized in policy. Let's make some adjustments.
I'm trying to figure out how to title this interview. Maybe MFA, Black Swan, and the Red Queen. I don't know. Maybe that's a title. Black Swan, Red Queen can help multi-factor authentication in the federal government. I don't know. This has been a lot of fun. I think our listeners have learned a lot here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Bryan Rosensteel, U.S. Federal CTO at Ping Identity. Thank you, Bryan.
John, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.